Left to his reflections, Abraham soon grew drowsy. Tess was not skilful in the management of a horse, but she thought that she could take upon herself the entire conduct of the load for the present, and allow Abraham to go to sleep if he wished to do so. She made him a sort of nest in front of the hives, in such a manner that he could not fall, and taking the reins into her own hands, jogged on as before. Prince required but slight attention, lacking energy for superfluous movements of any sort. With no longer a companion to distract her, Tess fell more deeply into reverie than ever, her back leaning against the hives. The mute procession past her shoulders of trees and hedges became attached to the fantastic scenes outside reality, and the occasional heave of the wind became the sigh of some immense, sad soul conterminous with the universe in space and with history in time. Then, examining the mesh of events in her own life, she seemed to see the vanity of her father's pride, the gentlemanly suitor awaiting her in her mother's fancy, to see him as a grimacing personage laughing at her poverty and her shrouded knightly ancestry. Everything grew more and more extravagant, and she no longer knew how time passed. A sudden jerk shook her in her seat, and Tess awoke from the sleep into which she too had fallen. They were a long way further down than when she had lost consciousness, and the waggon had stopped. A hollow groan, unlike anything she had ever heard in her life, came from the front, followed by a shout of "Hoy there!" The lantern hanging at her waggon had gone out, but another was shining in her face, much brighter than her own had been. Something terrible had happened. The harness was entangled with an object which blocked the way. In consternation Tess jumped down and discovered the dreadful truth. The groan had proceeded from her father's poor horse Prince. The morning mail cart, with its two noiseless wheels, speeding along these lanes like an arrow as it always did, had driven into her slow and unlighted equipage. The pointed shaft of the cart had entered the breast of the unhappy Prince like a sword, and from the wound his life's blood was spouting in a stream and falling with a hiss onto the road. In her despair Tess sprang forward and put her hand upon the hole, with the only result that she became splashed from face to skirt in the crimson drops. Then she stood helplessly looking on. Prince also stood firm and motionless as long as he could, till he suddenly sank down in a heap. By this time the mail cart man had joined her, and began dragging and unharnessing the hot form of Prince. But he was already dead, and seeing that nothing more could be done immediately, the mail cart man returned to his own animal, which was uninjured. "You was on the wrong side," he said. "I am bound to go with the mail bags, so that the best thing for you to do is to bide here with your load. I'll send some one to help you as soon as I can. It is getting daylight, and you have nothing to fear." He mounted and sped on his way, while Tess stood and waited. The atmosphere turned pale. The birds shook themselves in the hedges, arose and twittered. The lane showed all its white features, and Tess showed hers, still whiter. The huge pool of blood in front of her was already assuming the iridescence of coagulation, and when the sun rose 100 prismatic hues were reflected from it. Prince lay alongside still and stark, his eyes half open, the hole in his chest looking scarcely large enough to have let out all that had animated him. "'Tis all my doing, all mine!" the girl cried, gazing at the spectacle. "No excuse for me, none! What will mother and father live on now? Aby, Aby!" She shook the child, who had slept soundly through the whole disaster. "We can't go on with our load. Prince is killed." When Abraham realized all, the furrows of 50 years were extemporized on his young face. "Why, I danced and laughed only yesterday," she went on to herself. "To think that I was such a fool!" "'Tis because we be on a blighted star and not a sound one, isn't it, Tess?" murmured Abraham through his tears. In silence they waited through an interval which seemed endless. At length a sound and an approaching object proved to them that the driver of the mail cart had been as good as his word. A farmer's man from near Stowcastle came up, leading a strong cob. He was harnessed to the waggon of beehives in the place of Prince, and the load taken on towards Casterbridge. The evening of the same day saw the empty waggon reach again the spot of the accident. Prince had lain there in the ditch since the morning, but the place of the blood pool was still visible in the middle of the road, though scratched and scraped over by passing vehicles. All that was left of Prince was now hoisted into the waggon he had formerly hauled, and with his hoofs in the air and his shoes shining in the setting sunlight, he retraced the 8 or 9 miles back to Marlott. Tess had gone back earlier. How to break the news was more than she could think. It was a relief to her tongue to find from the faces of her parents that they already knew of their loss, though this did not lessen the self-reproach which she continued to heap upon herself for her negligence. But the very shiftlessness of the household rendered the misfortune a less terrifying one to them than it would have been to a striving family, though in the present case it meant ruin, and in the other it would only have meant inconvenience. In the Durbeyfield countenances there was nothing of the red wrath that would have been burnt upon the girl from parents more ambitious for her welfare. Nobody blamed Tess as she blamed herself. When it was discovered that the knacker and tanner would give only a very few shillings for Prince's carcass because of his decrepitude, Durbeyfield rose to the occasion. "No," said he stoically, "I won't sell his old body. Not when we d'Urbervilles was knights in the land, we didn't sell our chargers for cat's meat. Let 'em keep their shillings. He've served me well in his lifetime, and I won't part from him now." He worked harder the next day in digging a grave for Prince in the garden than he had worked for months to grow a crop for his family. When the hole was ready, Durbeyfield and his wife tied a rope round the horse and dragged him up the path towards it, the children following in a funeral train. Abraham and 'Liza Lu sobbed. Hope and modesty discharged their griefs in loud blares which echoed from the walls. And when Prince was tumbled in, they gathered round the grave. The breadwinner had been taken away from them. What would they do? "Is he gone to heaven?" asked Abraham between the sobs. Then Durbeyfield began to shovel in the earth, and the children cried anew, all except Tess. Her face was dry and pale, though she regarded herself in the light of a murderess. End of Chapter 4